All right, so we're on the last problem for implicit differentiation, and number 3 looks a little bit more complicated. As we were saying, implicit differentiation is when you're taking the derivative of a function where the dependent variable is not by itself. So here I see y floating all around in the middle. I don't see y by itself, so I know I need to use implicit. Now, the other ones were pretty basic because they were just polynomial terms, and each term either had an x or a y in here. However, if you look here, I got 1, 2, 3 terms, but this term has 2 variables in it. Well, that means that this here is going to require the product rule. So I have to take the product rule of this term, but then I need to continue taking the derivative of this term and taking the derivative of this term by using the power rule. So let's get started. So when you take the derivative of using the product rule, remember you could have used the key, but what did I say? The key is super helpful, but next year you're going to be taking the derivative quickly, so you're going to know how to do this in your sleep. You're just going to know the derivative of the first times the second plus the derivative of the second times the first is the rule for the product rule. So here we go. The derivative of the first. Well, remember, I've identified that y is the dependent variable. So it's going to be, everything's going to be the derivative of the variable with respect to the independent variable, which is x. And here, this would be dy dx, and this is dx dx, which we spoke about is not necessary to write. So when I go to do the product rule here, the derivative of the first just becomes 1 dx dx, but I'm not going to write that, times the second, so y squared. No dy dx there because I was just timesing it by the second, plus the derivative of the second. Well, the derivative of the second is 2y dy dx times the first. And this whole thing, well, that's the product rule. And say you go, I don't think I would mess that up. You can write it up here. The derivative of the first, that's 1, times the second, plus the derivative of the second, that's this whole thing, times the first. And that would reassure you that you got the product rule correct. And you make sure that you didn't forget a dy dx, but you're all good. Now I'm going to continue on to the next term. Once you've done this, I can go on to the next term, and y is my next term, and I'm just going to make it plus, now the derivative of y just is dy dx is equal to, and this becomes 1, and technically it's dx dx, but we've spoke that we don't need to write that. So this is my derivative of this implicit form, but I have several dy dx's. I know I just want to get dy dx by itself. So every term that contains a dy dx is going to stay on one side, and everything else needs to move. So this one needs to move. I'm going to need a minus 1y squared over. And so I get on this side 2y x dy dx plus dy dx is equal to 1 minus y squared. Okay, and you could have I probably really would have written this as 2xy dy dx just because I usually put this in alphabetical order, but you could have left it in this form too. Anyhow, you got the terms that contain dy dx on one side by itself. So now it's your turn. Whenever you have multiple dy dx's, you're going to GCF that dy dx out. There was a 1 in front there. So this just becomes 2, and I don't want to confuse you, but I'm just going to put it in alphabetical terms. So it's 2xy plus 1 is equal to 1 minus y squared. And last but not least, solve for your dy dx. And you get dy dx is equal to 1 minus y squared over 2xy plus 1. And that's your answer. So I'm going to give you for homework a couple of basic and some product rule a little bit more complicated, like number 3, to try for homework. I'm also going to put review of higher order derivative, just one question for higher order and one question on derivative table, just to keep that fresh in your head. And on Wednesday, we'll be doing more of this. This is a very important idea. So if you have any questions, be sure to come to the Google Meets from our extra helps that we post to get more problems answered. Thank you. Bye.